We're going to give people just a minute or two to log on and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm Julie Tighe. I am president of the New York League of Conservation Voters and the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. And I am joined by our Director of Policy, Patrick McClellan. We wanted to give folks an opportunity to hear about what happened in the 2022 legislative session here at the state, as well as sort of what progress we've made this year and what more work we have to do at the state level, and also touch a little bit on what's happened in the federal government and what work we have coming ahead of us on that front as well. So we can go to the next slide. There we are. We can go one more. Every year, NYLCV and NYLCV Education Fund develops a policy agenda. We work with our partners in the environmental movement, in environmental justice, in transportation, in public health, in parks advocates, to develop our policy agenda. That's something that we usually start in around August of any given year, and we issue it in the beginning of the year, usually right before the governor gives a State of the State address, so that we start the legislative session letting legislators know what's on our agenda for the coming year. And we use what's in the policy agenda to help dictate what ultimately is at the scorecard when we evaluate how legislators do over the course of the year. We publish that every year. It's listed on our website. We always focus on sort of big areas, right? We have different buckets that we really prioritize. So first thing that we put out, partially because of the cycle of the legislative session, is we put out our funding priorities. That's almost always the first thing that we list, because we know we need to be putting our money where our mouth is and getting elected officials to be investing in the environment. So we identify a whole slew of priorities that we have related to making sure that there's enough staff at the environmental agencies, that there's funding for the Environmental Protection Fund, for water infrastructure, for fighting climate change, for making investments in mass transit, all of those items, anything related to a tax credit that you might want to use to encourage people to take action one way or the other, that would all go into our funding priorities. We then have many pages on climate change, because those are really in multiple. I think we have 5 categories this year in our agenda. So that's where we focus on clean energy, on clean transportation, on how we're reducing waste, on what kind of jobs we're creating, and making sure that we're taking action to fight climate change by addressing emissions associated with buildings. So really, we have a whole bunch of different priorities that we've identified under each of those different categories that we work on related to climate change. Then we have to worry about public health, right? There's a direct correlation, we know, between environmental damages that are done and public health. So this is where we do a lot of our work related to chemicals policies, trying to eliminate the use of forever chemicals like PFAS, where we focus on addressing lead contamination, working with our partners on the Lead-Free Kids Coalition, and really focusing on some of those issues that are really very, very directly public health oriented. Of course, natural resources make up a big part of the work that we do. We certainly have focused on that, and we work with a lot of partners in identifying what the various priorities are related to protecting our natural resources, wetlands, open space preservation, parks investments, those kinds of priorities. And then lastly, we focus on agriculture. We need to make sure that we have access to fresh and healthy foods, that we're preserving farmland, that there's opportunities for the farming community to work together with renewable energy, which is a symbiotic, can be a very symbiotic relationship. And we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's thoughtful and valuable, and tackling the issues associated with agriculture and climate change. Now, within our state policy agenda, we then have sort of 4 big areas that we've identified as our top priorities for the year, right? So this year, we really focused in, for not the first year and not the last year, on clean transportation, right? This is where we know we need to take action to get more people into EVs, and how can we take policy measures to advance that? How can we make sure that we're decarbonizing all the fuels that we're using? And so we're pushing for a clean fuel standard to both encourage, incentivize moving to electric vehicles, but also moving to renewable fuels for the vehicles that rely on fuels for the time being. We're working really hard on electrification of our mass transit and school buses. So that's all were sort of top priorities for us this year. Making sure that we're moving towards zero waste is really, really critical. It's an under-discussed part of the climate problem, and a real opportunity for us to take action as individuals, but more importantly on the institutional and government level, by passing laws to require extended producer responsibility for various products. Our big push this year was on packaging. Pat will talk more about that later, so that we make sure that we're reducing the amount of waste that's going to landfills. That's really something that we need to take action on. We have a problem. We have on Long Island, for example, the last landfill is going to be closing in the very near future. And there's a lot of opportunities for us to be reducing the amount of waste that's going to landfill and moving us towards a more circular economy. And we want to make sure that we're taking action to do that. This year, of course, we're focusing extra on resiliency and getting the Bond Act passed that was originally passed in 2020. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then, of course, all of this is foundational on us working on clean energy. So making sure that we're continuing to take action on that front. So we have a lot, if you look at our policy agenda on our website, we have dozens and dozens of things that we were advancing this year, some of which got done, some of which didn't. We'll get into that more in a moment. Really, the legislative session is kind of divided into 2 different times when you take action. One is the state budget, and the governor puts out her budget in January, and they hold hearings on that budget. The legislature develops their own budgets to respond to the governor's budget. They negotiate and they come together usually by or around April 1st. This year we were around April 1st. We were timely, as some former governors might have said. And so that is really when we got our first tranche of action done. But then the second half of the session is when you get more of the legislative bills done that don't require money or that don't implicate the state's financial situation. So that is now a little bit earlier with the changing of the state primaries to June, which they did just a few years ago. Now the legislative session ends a little bit earlier. So it's really ends at the first week in June is when they finish this year. And so we probably will see that going on. When the primary was in September, of course, we used to have a session that went all the way through the month of June, but now it has changed. So it's a slightly different dynamic when that happens. I will say this, that the governor tends to have more power and influence during the budget because of the way the state's constitution sets out the powers between the governor and the legislature tends to have a little bit more during the legislative session. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about one of our budget wins this year, and then I'm going to hand it over to Pat to talk about the rest. So we had, as I mentioned, there's a bond act that will be on the ballot in November. This was first passed in 2020 for $3 billion. And unfortunately, there was concern because of the pandemic that the state's financial situation would not be good enough. And so the budget director was authorized to be able to sort of pull that back. And he exercised that authority in 2020. So it did not move forward, which I think turned out to be a good thing, because Governor Hochul came in last year and said, $3 billion is great. I think we can do better. And what we ended up at now is at a $4.2 billion Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act. It's broken down into 4 big buckets of funds. There's $650 million for water infrastructure. There's $650 million for open space conservation. There's $1.1 billion for flood risk reduction and resiliency projects. And there's $1.5 billion for climate mitigation. And that includes $500 million for purchasing of electric school buses. So we're super excited about this. There is a campaign being pulled together. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to Vote Yes for cleanwaterandjobs.org for more information about the Bond Act and what will be before us. But we're really excited about that. It's going to generate over 85,000 jobs, according to a study that AECOM did, and our partners at Amy's organization.
Rebuild by Design.
Thank you, Rebuild by Design. They did that study for the coalition, and we're really excited about that opportunities. And we are working with many other environmental organizations, civic organizations, and labor community to help move that forward. So that was a really, really big win that we had this year, and we're super excited about it. We have not had a bond act in the state of New York since 1996. So it's long overdue. It'll be the largest environmental bond act on the ballot this November in the entire country. So we're very excited about that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pat.
Great, thanks, Julie. So first off, I think it's important to note for the bond act for the $500 million for electric school buses, that is going to help school districts comply with another piece of the budget, which requires all school buses in the state to be 100% zero emission by 2035. All new purchases will have to be zero emission starting in, I believe, 2028. And that was something that we led a coalition in support of. We're really excited about it. It's a nation-leading effort to completely decarbonize our school bus fleets. Right now, school buses almost entirely, with the exception of a few pilot programs, are fueled by diesel. And so you have kids sitting on those buses, you have these buses, driving through the neighborhoods where we all live, emitting diesel fumes. And so this is a big win, not just for climate change and reducing the state's emissions, but also for improving public health, because asthma is the #1 reason for school absenteeism in New York State. Beyond that, we also this year increased the Environmental Protection Fund to $400 million. It had been kind of stuck at $300 million for a number of years. And the EPF is a sort of unassuming but quietly important part of the budget for environmental programs. And that's because this is a grant program that funds environmental protection programs around the state. And so, if you're a small town or a school district, for instance, that is trying to implement a food waste reduction program, for instance, trying to create a local composting program, the EPF has funds set aside that can help fund that. If you're trying to do air monitoring, speaking of diesel pollution, in a lower income community that's next to a highway, for instance, there's money in the EPF for those kinds of programs, for land conservation, for parks, for clean water. This is sort of the nuts and bolts environmental funding, where it's not huge sums of money, but it's a grant of, say, $50,000, $100,000 that really makes a difference at the community scale. So we were thrilled to increase that by $100 million this year. There's also $500 million to continue developing the state's offshore wind supply chain and port infrastructure. We have a statutory goal in New York of establishing 7,000 megawatts of offshore wind by, I believe, 2035 is the date. Yeah,
9,000.
9,000. Forgot that we increased. So, you know, we're getting there on that. There have been multiple solicitations. There are multiple projects in the work, but we still have a long way to go. But in the building of those wind farms and then the maintenance of them, that is a lot of jobs. It's even more jobs when you consider that states up and down the East Coast are considering similar proposals, though no one as ambitious as New York. And you're likely only going to have a few ports that do all of that service. So being the first to the game is important on that, because if New York builds the supply chain for this, creates the jobs that are going to build and staff these wind farms, it's not just jobs in the offshore wind that's going to come onto New York's energy grid. It's also the offshore wind that's going to go into Connecticut and Massachusetts, that's going to go into New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. We can get a huge chunk of those jobs by investing now in the supply chain and in job training. So that's very exciting. And then finally, we also had $500 million for clean water infrastructure, which is a big deal. I was going to say at first that it's not exciting, but it is. But it's because we've been doing $500 million every year for clean water infrastructure for 5 years now. Again, there's no other state in the country that is putting this much money into clean water infrastructure, and that's getting rid of old pipes, including lead pipes. It's testing for emerging contaminants like PFAS and PFOA. It's filtering for those new chemicals. It's building new sewer systems to prevent sewage overflows into our bodies of water. It's really exciting. It's nation leading, and it can kind of feel blasé because we've been doing it every year for 5 years now, but it is actually very exciting. And then just one last thing on the budget. It was a big year, and then we'll move on. We also got a 10-year extension of the brownfield redevelopment tax credit system. And the way that works is that when you have blighted properties that are contaminated because of past industrial use, very often it's the site of a former auto body shop, for instance, where there's oil in the ground. You can't really do anything with that property until it's been remediated. And the state does not have the resources to go around doing all this remediation itself. And so with the brownfield redevelopment program, there are tax credits that fund redevelopment that often have strings attached to them, especially in New York City, like, for instance, that you have to redevelop it as affordable housing. And so it's a way to take blighted properties and return them to a beneficial use for the community, again, especially in New York City, where under the current iteration of the program, there's been a huge focus on building affordable housing on these lots once they've been remediated. So it's exciting that we got a long-term extension of that program.
I think we had one more policy thing in the budget.
Yes, there was one more that I forgot about, which was the largest expansion of wetlands protection in the state in a generation. I won't get into the specifics because it gets a bit complicated, but essentially a lot of small and mid-sized wetlands were falling through the gaps of not being protected by either the federal government or by state government. And so sort of lowering the threshold at which the state is regulating these wetlands is a huge deal to protect local ecosystems, keep these wetlands from being paved over or destroyed. And that's important, not just because they support the whole ecosystem around them, but also because wetlands are very important for flood mitigation, which, as Julie sort of touched on in her comments about the Bond Act, is an increasingly important thing that we have to worry about with climate change.
I think we can go to the next slide.
So here are some of the big wins that we had in the legislative session post-budget. So first on buildings, we had a couple of bills that we were very enthusiastic about. The first is new energy efficiency standards for new construction in buildings and also for appliances. This is kind of the lowest hanging fruit for reducing our emissions. Building more efficient buildings, but also making sure that things like your refrigerator, your cable box, video game consoles, things like that are not sucking up power. Because the more that we reduce energy in the first place, the easier it is to get to our goals of 100% renewable energy. So this was a long time coming and we're excited about it. The next bill is so this is not a good name, but Utility Thermal Energy Jobs Act. Basically, it means district level geothermal systems that utilities are going to be building with union labor. Geothermal energy is an emissions-free way to heat and cool buildings. So this is exciting because it's going to help us reduce our emissions from buildings, but also because the bill is really a partnership between organized labor and the environmental movement,
And the utilities,
which
is unheard of, and environmental justice groups. It was a win-win-win-win. It was amazing. Very unusual for that to happen.
Yep. Excuse me. Moving on, we also got an extension and expansion of New York City's speed camera program. You might be wondering why an environmental group was working on these issues or on this issue. And it's because, we can't get where we need to go on clean transportation through electric vehicles alone. We also need more people walking, biking, taking scooters, using other forms of micromobility. And the number one reason why people don't do that is that they are worried about their safety. So safer streets are greener streets. If you can take the next one.
Yeah, sure.
Really
Go ahead.
So the next bill that we are supporting that passed this year is a bill called 30 by 30. This is actually something that's happening all across the country. And President Biden actually made a commitment to protect 30% of our lands and waters so that we are protecting them, in perpetuity, to making sure that they're available for people to use. So we were really excited. We had a bill introduced last year that would establish this law here in New York. It was passed this year, which we're super excited about. Now we're working on how we can move towards implementation to make sure that we're protecting those lands. This is obviously about the state protecting land, but it's also about local governments protecting lands as well as private landowners, to making sure that the lands that we have available for, that are forested or have wildlife habitat or have wetlands continue to be protected and available to provide the ecosystem services that they provide, both for wildlife as well as for our communities. So this is a bill that is happening all across the country. We're super excited that New York State was able to advance it this year and to get that over the finish line. To be honest with you, I didn't know that we would get it done this year. And so it was really exciting that everyone came together and made that happen. So that was another big win that we had this year, was getting that 30 by 30 land conservation bill advanced.
Thank you. And so the last bill we had on here is extended producer responsibility for carpeting. Extended producer responsibility, or EPR for short, is basically when you hold the manufacturer of an item responsible for the safe recycling or disposal of an item at the end of its useful life. So that's a way to save taxpayers money, to divert waste from landfills, to make sure that we're looking at the full life cycle of products. Carpeting is very difficult to get rid of. And so the hope is that with this program, we're diverting waste from landfills and improving sustainability in this sector. We had a couple of other bills as well, requiring the state fleet to be 100% zero emission by 2035, requiring parking to be electric vehicle ready in new construction that gets state funding, and banning PFAS chemicals in clothing.
So these are bills that we're considering for our scorecard. We have, I think, 19 bills this year that we're considering for our scorecard as we've notified the legislature. Again, they're sort of all based on what we put into our policy agenda at the beginning of the year. And we, of course, notify legislators during the legislative session about bills that we're identifying, as well as issuing memos on those bills along the way. But of course, it's not all wine and roses. These are the bills that got done, but there are more bills that did not get done as well. So if we can go on to the next slide.
Do you want to clean fuels?
I will take clean fuels. So we have been leading a coalition since 2020 called Clean Fuels New York. We're advocating for a clean fuel standard, or a low carbon fuel standard, as it's sometimes known as, that would require a reduction of 20% of the carbon associated with fuels for all of our transportation fuels. That would create incentives for people to move to electric, particular fleets and businesses, and to move to electric and to other sources of renewable fuels, so that we're decarbonizing the fuels that we're using, relying less on oil, which, as we all know right now, is subject to global geopolitical forces and determining prices that can provide stabler prices associated with that, and make sure that we're reducing the amount of pollution associated with the transportation sector. So this bill, we made progress on it this year. We have overwhelming majorities in both houses of members who are on the legislation. We have more than 90 co-sponsors in the Assembly, more than I think we're over 40 in this in the Senate. The Senate included it in their one House budget this year. So this is something that they're talking about as part of the climate action plan, and it's something that we're excited to move forward on. So that's something that we're continuing to advocate for with our coalition members on that. But we have other things that we have, and yes, not every bill that we are going to talk about is on the slide. Some will be added later. I see some of the comments have popped up. We'll get to some of those bills as we move forward.
Yep. So the next bill that we pushed really hard on, we're disappointed to see it not get done, is EPR for packaging. So this covers all kinds of packaging, but particularly looking at things like cardboard boxes, e-commerce, all of this stuff that we're getting in the mail. And again, requiring the diversion of more of this waste from landfills, and requiring the companies that are producing all this waste in the first place to be responsible for recycling it or for diverting it from landfills, to massively improve the sustainability of packaging, but also to save taxpayers money, streamline our recycling system, and really find ways to make the entire waste stream more sustainable.
Yeah, right now, all our garbage basically is paid for by taxpayers, and this would create incentives for manufacturers to make their materials more recyclable, and incentivize them to get higher recycling rates, because the recycling rate overall in the state of New York right now is something like 17 or 20%. It's very, very low. So this is a way where we really need to move forward. Again, as we mentioned earlier, how are we getting to zero waste? And this is an easy way for us to help move in that direction.
Yeah. So the next bill has to do with what are often called legacy renewable energy projects. So anything new renewable that's been built in basically the last 20 years has gotten subsidy from the state or state aid in financing. But we have a lot of hydropower and a little bit of wind in upstate New York that is much older than that. That is also critically important for us to meet our clean energy goals. If those legacy hydropower projects, for instance, start selling into other states, we have to replace that. That makes it harder for us to get to 100% clean energy. And so what this Tier 2 program, proposed Tier 2 program would do is provide some additional supports to those legacy renewable energy projects to keep them in New York State, to keep their clean energy online, to help us meet the goal of 100% clean energy by 2040. On transportation, we also supported a bill to lift this artificial cap on the sale of zero emission vehicles in the state. Essentially, for a number of newer companies in the market that only sell zero emission vehicles, this includes Tesla, but also companies like Lucid and Rivian. In New York, there are only 5 permits for, and Tesla has all of them, for them to directly sell their vehicles to consumers. In other states, there are not these artificial restrictions. And as a result, even in states like Florida that do not have most of the supports for electric vehicles that we have, they have dramatically higher sales of electric vehicles. So if we want to get to 100% zero emission vehicle sales, we have to remove these artificial barriers that are preventing new zero emission vehicle companies from being able to sell their vehicles in New York State. This is an issue of environmental sustainability and reaching our goals, but it's also kind of a basic issue of consumer fairness. And then finally, we just missed the cutoff for adding this to the slide. I saw someone mention it in the comments, but the all electric buildings bill as well we worked on. What that would do is ban the use of on-site fossil fuels in new construction, beginning in 2024, I believe, for single family homes, and eventually scaling up to all new construction in the state with some limited exemptions starting in 2027. It's important to get that on the books because eventually we need all buildings to be fully zero emission in their heating and cooling, in their cooking, in everything that goes on. And the obvious place to start on that is with new construction. And we have the technology right now for taller buildings and for some buildings that have specialized needs like hospitals. It's a little more complicated, which is why you can't just flip a switch and do it tomorrow. You need to have a lead-in period, which is why 2027 makes sense and why it makes sense to have some limited exemptions, again, for special use cases like hospitals. But, if you don't start with new construction, if you don't get the ball rolling on this, if you don't train contractors in how to build and install these technologies, train buildings and how to operate them efficiently, we're not going to get to our long-term goals of completely decarbonizing buildings. So that's an important part of the story. We built a lot of momentum on the All Electric Buildings Act, I would say, and just didn't quite get it across the line, but I feel good about where we are going into the next legislative session.
And I think what's important there is that New York City has already adopted a law that requires that, which is obviously where most of the very tall buildings are. But this is like, how are we going to deal with the rest of the state? We need to start taking action on. So that is definitely something that's in the category of things we want to work on for 2022. I think we probably had a few other bills that we're considering for the scorecard that haven't passed both houses. But certainly those are the top ones that we have on our minds right now. I think we've seen, based on the Supreme Court's decision, how important it is that states are leading the way. And we're very fortunate that New York, A, has a very aggressive climate law. And B, we have, leadership in the governor's office, in the Senate, and in the Assembly who are prioritizing these issues. I think we were hoping we would get some more action this year out of the legislature. We couldn't quite get there, but certainly we know that this is something that Governor Hochul continues to talk about and puts it front and center. We know now more than ever, based on the Supreme Court decision undermining EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions at power plants, that we need the state to take action, but more importantly and more timely, we need Congress to take action. So we've been pushing Senator Schumer to advance some meaningful climate legislation in the Senate. We know the House has already passed legislation that we're hoping that they can come together and get something done here in the Senate. I think we've all heard way too much about a particular senator from West Virginia, but certainly it seems like climate will be part of a discussion about getting a bill passed. So we're really excited about that. But we need to make sure that action happens sooner rather than later, because the federal government needs to be part of the solution in providing supports towards electrification of our transportation sector, of making sure that we're making more investments in clean energy. Maybe we can start not giving so many subsidies to fossil fuel industries at the same time. So certainly this is something that we've been advocating for, but I do think highlights how important it is that we have state leadership that is taking action, because when we don't have support happening from the federal government, we need to make sure that it's happening at the state level. And EPA has just been hamstrung in their ability to take action. I know that they're, President Biden and the administrator at EPA are working on different ways of addressing that, but it's certainly something that we want to make sure gets done. So there's lots happening. There's also, of course, work we need to do at the local level, but that's a conversation for another day. So I think with that, we can turn over to some questions. I will say on the front end, yes, we are recording this. We'll be sending out the recording to everyone who registered and making it available on our website. And we will be more than happy to share the slides. I did see there was a question about the bill number for all electric buildings. Pat, do you happen to have that, or can we track that down?
I don't have that in front of me, but that is definitely something that we can share.
And that will definitely be in the slides, because as Pat mentioned, that was one that was, we were asking, thank you, someone just dropped it in. Thank you for doing that. So it is Assembly 8431, Senate 7863. We have a person who's asking about the electrifying lawn equipment bill that actually did pass both houses of the legislature this year. It is a bill that we are going to be putting on our scorecard. So certainly, yes, we will be writing a letter to the governor asking her to sign that legislation. So certainly that is something that's been on our minds, and we have spoken to the governor's office about that earlier in the year. They may be that they have some technical things that they might want to address with that, but it is something that it's hard to imagine her not signing. I'm trying to look, if you can use the QA function for people who have questions, that would be great. All right, someone is asking about the Community Preservation Fund bill.
If this is, so I don't have my service that I use to look up bills right in front of me right now, but if this is a bill that I'm thinking of on authorizing community preservation funds statewide, that is a bill that we support, that we've supported in the past. It's a little politically tricky, not necessarily because there's opposition, but because the legislature kind of jealously guards its authority over things. When you have a system where you need to go to Albany to specifically request something, they tend to not be in favor of advancing bills that say, actually, you don't have to do that anymore. That's one of the problems that we have with getting the speed camera program in New York City reauthorized every so often. And so that's the issue that comes up with community preservation funds as well, is that the legislature, not everyone, but institutionally, the legislature likes the current system where each community preservation fund in the state has to have a discrete act of the legislature to authorize it. Would like to see that change, but there was not really any momentum on that bill in this session.
And that is something that we know we have when they do the, case by case one, we also do support that. All right, so someone's asking if we can discuss the cumulative impacts environmental justice legislation. That's another bill that we've said we would put on the scorecard this year.
Yeah, so that's an exciting bill that sets new oversight standards for the siting of any potentially hazardous facility in environmental justice communities. I know that there is some concern from the governor's office and from the city and some other local governments about whether or not it would prevent the re-permitting of existing facilities, like, for instance, a waste transfer station, where if everything had to be re-permitted all at once, that would obviously kind of create chaos. So I think they're looking for what are called chapter amendments to the bill to clarify that that's not the case, that it's only new things that you're talking about. But yeah, I mean, it's a paradigm shifting bill to say, you don't get to continue putting these kinds of facilities in communities that are already overburdened by them. And it's, a step in the right direction to address New York's history of environmental racism. It doesn't solve the problem, but definitely a step in the right direction. And, we were glad to support it.
All right, we have another question about Class C streams, which was another exciting bill that got done this year.
Yes. So
It's Class C.
Yep. So this is another bill that had been around for a while. Class C streams are small streams. I think there's like a definition related to their width or depth. But it kind of goes a little bit to the wetlands issue in that you have these smaller but still ecologically very important bits of nature all around the state that are important to local ecosystems, are important to our agricultural systems, are important for storm resilience, for climate resiliency. And these smaller pieces fall through the cracks of the existing environmental protection regime that we have. If you let the small stuff go, you end up having the bigger stuff that is protected suffering as well. Class C streams are important because they feed into larger bodies of water. And so if you're not protecting them, you're actually harming the larger bodies of water that are protected. And so this, again, sort of along with the wetlands piece that passes part of the budget, is an important way of advancing environmental protection in New York.
Now, Pat, we missed a bill. And the Finger Lakes.
Oh, yes. So another bill that should have gone in the wins chart established a 2-year moratorium on proof of work cryptocurrency mining. So with cryptocurrency, I'm sure that folks are familiar with the stories about how energy intensive it is. That is called proof of work cryptocurrency mining, where you basically have to do advanced mathematical equations to mine new coins. It takes a lot of computer servers to do that, to run all these equations. There is a different system called proof of work, which is why I distinguish between the two. Proof of work is way less energy intensive. It's not something that we as an environmental group, would take action on. But proof of work cryptocurrency mining, because it has already brought at least one formerly shuttered natural gas power plant back online, producing new greenhouse gas emissions, we really want to make sure that for this maybe growing, maybe not industry, that we have DEC really take a look at the problem, really make sure that we're being smart about this, really make sure that cryptocurrency mining is not harming our ability to achieve the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act.
Great. So yes, that we can add that one. I know there was a question asking us to put the bill number. We can add that to the slideshow that we circulate. And if Andrew is out there somewhere, or if we can get someone from staff to drop that in the chat, that would be super helpful on Class C streams. We had a question. Okay, sorry. Okay, there's a question that's saying in Westchester, there's a big problem with flooding from the Bronx River and other waterways impacting the roadways. Would you support the development of more wetlands along these waterways to protect the waterways and roadways from flooding? That's exactly the type of project that funding from the Bond Act will support. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that we'd like to do is we want to make sure that we're right sizing culverts, for example, certainly using nature. They're called wetlands for a reason, right? They like the water and they absorb water and they prevent some of the flooding that occurs. So and certainly something that we are interested in and supportive of. It obviously requires a lot of appropriate planning and engineering to make sure that we're using the right types of infrastructure, but we want to make sure that we're using nature-based solutions to help to absorb the water. Certainly, as we move forward, New York State is going to be inundated with water. Out west, they're going to have wildfires and droughts, but out east, we're going to get more intense and more frequent rainfall. So certainly it's something that we need to be taking action on. There's also funding, not just from the Bond Act, but from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that will help to support these. And we're supportive of making sure that the DOT, when they issue grants, encourages uses of nature-based solutions to help us to protect our infrastructure, such as the roadways that you've identified there. So thank you for that question. Someone's asked us to discuss the climate jobs bill signed by the governor. I think you mean the bill that requires prevailing wage for smaller solar projects. Certainly, we've been working more with labor, and we support, right now for all large scale utility scale projects in the state of New York that are supported by NYSERDA or other government funding are required to have both project labor agreements and prevailing wages paid to make sure that workers are earning fair family sustaining wages. They passed legislation this year that was signed the same day that the governor signed the utility thermal energy bill and the building codes and standards legislation that lowers that threshold from 5 megawatts for a solar project to 1 megawatt solar project. I think that's really important because now the state has a goal of getting 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar, and so having prevailing wages on those smaller projects, I think, is also really important to making sure that we are ensuring a just transition for workers while we're also improving the environment and investing in clean energy. I'm just looking at, I think there's someone's asking about a specific bill that I'm not familiar with. Pat, I don't know if you know
No,
this.
I'm not either.
Okay, so I think we can look into that legislation that you've identified, and we would probably talk to some of our partners like the Nature Conservancy about that, but that was not one that we had highlighted this year. There are literally 10,000 bills that get introduced in a legislative session, hence the very long bill numbers. So we don't always get every single one of them, but then again, it often takes multiple sessions for legislation to get passed. And so, it's something that we can look at and see if it's something we should be focusing on for next year. But again, I think in general, we are supportive of, because this is saying it's encouraging the use of nature-based solutions as alternatives for stabilizing tidal shorelines. That again is something that certainly the Bond Act will be supportive of. And we've done some work previously and held some forums on using green infrastructure for a variety of purposes. So certainly making sure that we're using those nature-based solutions is really critical to make sure that we're protecting our communities as well as protecting habitats. Okay. Someone's asking if if the state legislature needs to come back because of the Supreme Court's decision related to West Virginia versus EPA and undermining their ability to address EPA's ability to address greenhouse gas emissions. That does not change DEC's authority. The state of New York is authorized to go further than the Clean Air Act does. Our state laws and RGGI and things like that have not been undermined. So we already regulate greenhouse gas emissions associated with power plants here in the state of New York. And so this is not, something we'd like them to take more action to address climate change. They have not done enough this year, I think, on transportation. Obviously, we wanted them to pass the buildings bill so that we start moving forward on new clean buildings.
I find it unlikely that they're going to be coming back before the November elections, and certainly not before the August Senate primary. So certainly we're grateful for the fact that the state of New York has this authority and is not undermined by that. And I think the commissioner and the governor both asserted that and affirmed that, and we are not at risk, I don't think, of litigation related to that right now.
Yeah, and it's important to note too, the Supreme Court case specifically involved the Clean Power Plan rule that the Obama administration had issued, and then the repeal and much weaker successor rule that the Trump administration had proposed. And under either version of that, as well as anything that the Biden EPA has considered, New York would not have to act because we have already taken much more aggressive action on power plant emissions than anything that the federal government has proposed.
All right, so the next question we have relates to the definition of disadvantaged communities that has been proposed by the department related to eligibility and defining disadvantaged communities. We are providing comments on that. We have not been as involved as some of our friends in the environmental justice movement have been, but certainly we will be providing comments on the proposal that DEC has advanced to inform that rulemaking.
Yeah, and I would just say too, we're going to be weighing in on some of the definitions. Basically saying that they should be considering some things that are not considered in the draft criteria. Like for instance, access to transportation is not considered. We think that that's important, particularly for resiliency. Access to flood insurance is not considered. We think that's important. So we're weighing in on sort of definitionally, what are you thinking about when you're trying to define what a disadvantaged community is. We are not, though, commenting on the map itself and saying, you know, this census tract versus that one should be in or out.
Okay, I think that was all the questions we had in the queue. We have time for one or two more questions if people want to get something in. If not, we can give people 5 minutes back of their lives, which is always nice when that happens. Okay, well, seeing none, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. And thank you for your thoughtful questions and your awareness of all the legislation that's out there. It's really important for people to be weighing in, you know, both with the legislature and with the governor and the agencies when there's administrative actions that are moving forward. They need to hear from people that they know that it's important. So we're excited to continue this work. We have a lot more work to do. 2022 is an important year, you know, to take action. And we see again how critical it is to have states that have strong laws when, you know, the Supreme Court is removing the authority that the EPA has. And I think we need to make sure that we continue to keep pushing the legislature and the governor to keep advancing climate change actions so that we can take our part and really show leadership to other states in the region, in the country, in the world, because we are willing to take some actions that are sort of first mover actions that can prove things out, that can help things come to scale and make them less expensive to do and prove that it can work in a way that doesn't undermine our economy. And I think those are really important positions for the state of New York to be in as we're moving forward. So thank you all so much for joining me and Pat talk about how this legislative session went. We thank you for your time and we hope to talk to you again soon. Bye.